And did you have a comment?
Yes.
Okay. And this is pertaining to the Housing Regulations Ordinance 8719, read for the second time. Okay.
Correct.
And your name and address.
My name is Damon Krane. I live on Hudson Avenue in Athens, and I'm running for mayor of Athens as an independent Democratic Socialist. At first glance, I think this ordinance sounds great. After all, it's part of what Ellie Hamrick and I have been campaigning on for the past 6 months, so I'm happy to see we're already changing city policy for the better. But while talking about slumlords doing jail time makes for dramatic headlines, the problem is that no matter how tough sounding a piece of legislation is, it doesn't mean anything if it's not enforced. And right now we've got two big problems with enforcement. The first problem is that we've got a code enforcement office that's too understaffed to be able to uncover the vast majority of violations. For 5 solid months, Mayor Patterson tried to get away with claiming that we have 6 or 7 rental housing inspectors, when, as I've been pointing out, and as the Athens News finally verified last week, we only have 4 rental housing inspectors. To actually enforce the housing code, we'd need for all of the mayor's 7 imaginary inspectors to be actual real-life city employees, and to add 1 more inspector on top of that. The second problem with enforcement is that we've got a city law director who for decades has been disregarding the housing code and bending over backwards to let slumlords off the hook. How do you increase penalties for multiple offenses when Law Director Eliason treats multiple offenses as a single offense? And what's the point of passing any ordinance at all if the law director is just free to ignore it and do whatever she wants anyway? These aren't academic questions. They make real differences in the lives of the 80% of city residents who live in rental housing. I'll give you an example. Once upon a time, I rented an apartment on First Street. Code enforcement had inspected it a few months before I moved in, and at that inspection found 0 violations. But after I moved in, I found all kinds of problems, from gas leaks to missing fire safety equipment to a roof that was full of holes to damaged and unsanitary flooring to clogged plumbing and mold and more. And after I brought these problems to the attention of code enforcement, they agreed, and they cited my landlord for nearly 24 separate violations. That's what the Code Enforcement Office means in its annual reports when they say that due to limited staffing, they're a complaint-driven agency. They don't have the resources to conduct adequate inspections, so they depend on tenants themselves to identify and report most violations. And since most Athens tenants are inexperienced, first or second-time renters in their early 20s, most violations don't get reported, they don't get corrected, they just pile up year after year after year until a rare complaint-driven inspection suddenly uncovers dozens of violations all at once.
Mr. Krane, you've got about 30 seconds.
Thank you. Now, the housing code says that each day of each violation is a separate and complete offense. So in my case, my landlord was looking at thousands of offenses and up to $250,000 in fines. But Law Director Eliason, who was then the city prosecutor on my case, decided to treat thousands of offenses as just one offense. And in the end, my landlord was fined a grand total of $75. I had to spend nearly half of my lease term paying to live in an unsafe apartment, and thanks to Law Director Eliason, the landlord had to pay a $75 fine. To be continued.
Thank you. Yes.
I also had a comment.
Okay. And you'll have 3 minutes likewise. Thank you. And if you could let us know your name and address.
Sure. My name is Ellie Hamrick. I'm a member of the Athens Revolutionary Socialists, and I rent an apartment on the south side. I'm running for city council as an independent socialist. I'm happy to see City Council finally taking a small step toward curbing the copious abuses of slumlords in our community. However, like Damon, I am concerned that the ordinance does not go nearly far enough in protecting the vast majority of Athens residents who are renters. Ask virtually any renter in Athens about their experience with landlords, and you are sure to hear horror stories. Just this week, I heard from tenants about chronically flooded basements, broken glass, smells of stale urine, roofs caving in, exposed wires, leaking plumbing, extreme humidity, bed bugs, mold, unauthorized entry, and broken fire alarms. I also heard from a young woman who finally ended things with an abusive boyfriend, only to find herself facing eviction because her landlord is insisting that she pay her ex's back rent, even though she is on disability and a fixed income. I empathize with her because a couple of years ago, I found myself homeless after leaving an abusive partner. Unfortunately, it's a common problem. So we need tougher penalties for landlords with multiple violations, absolutely. But we also need to strengthen the housing code itself, and we need to adequately staff the code enforcement office so that they can be proactive and not have to rely on complaints from tenants who may not know their rights or may feel too vulnerable or intimidated to report issues for a variety of reasons. We also desperately need rent control. Many people who work in Athens already cannot afford to live here, and if we succeed in forcing landlords to clean up their properties, we'll also need to make sure they don't pass those costs on to tenants. Damon spoke to another major issue, which is the fact that Law Director Eliason treats multiple violations as one, no matter how many violations there are or how long they persist. The case Damon talked about with his landlord was all the way back in 2008. But just last week, Eliason told the Athens News that letting landlords off the hook by treating multiple violations as one remains standard operating procedure. So what does it mean to increase violations if we don't have an adequate system for inspecting properties, identifying violations, or enforcing violations? None of you are wage workers or renters, and at least a couple of you are landlords, so it's not surprising that you've waited until your hand was forced to do anything about the awful living conditions your neighbors endure. As a working-class renter and a socialist, I intend to do right by the 80% of Athenians who live in rental housing if I'm elected. But I also recognize that real change does not come from City Council. It comes from workers and tenants ourselves. We greatly outnumber bosses and landlords, and when we get organized, we can turn this whole community and this whole world upside down. It's long past time we formed a tenants union to protect and defend each other, to fight for lower rent and better conditions. It's long past time we were united to fight for a world with no landlords at all, in which safe and livable housing is a human right. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Thank you for the comments.